My name is Michael Harrison, and for 38 years I believed I was the illegitimate son of one of the wealthiest men in Texas. My mother, Patricia, had raised me alone in a small apartment on the wrong side of Dallas, working double shifts as a waitress, while my so-called father lived in a mansion with his real family just 20 miles away. She had told me the story 1,000 times about how she and Robert Harrison had been deeply in love, but that his family had forced him to marry someone of their social class instead of a poor girl from the projects. According to my mother, Robert had promised to take care of us, but his wife had discovered the affair and threatened to destroy him financially if he ever acknowledged me publicly. So he sent monthly checks through a lawyer, enough to keep us housed and fed, but never enough to lift us out of poverty. My mother would sit at our kitchen table every month, counting the money that arrived in plain white envelopes with no return address, tears in her eyes as she told me how much my father loved me, but how complicated his situation was. She made him sound like a tragic romantic figure, trapped by circumstances beyond his control, forced to love his son from a distance to protect both our safety and his family's reputation. I grew up believing this story completely, never questioning why a man wealthy enough to own half of Dallas couldn't find a way to have a relationship with his son. I spent my childhood watching from across the street as Robert Harrison's legitimate children attended private schools, drove expensive cars, and lived lives of privilege that seemed impossibly distant from my own reality. When I turned 18, my mother finally told me his name and showed me newspaper articles about Harrison Industries, the construction empire that had made Robert Harrison one of the richest men in the state. She explained that someday, when the time was right, I would be able to claim my rightful inheritance as his son. She had kept documentation of everything, she assured me, proof that would establish paternity and ensure I received what was legally mine. For 20 years, I carried this knowledge like a secret weight, watching Robert Harrison's business success from afar and imagining the day when I would finally meet the father who had loved me enough to support me, but never enough to claim me. When he died suddenly of a heart attack at age 72, I knew my time had finally come. My mother and I gathered all the documentation she had saved over the years, copies of checks, letters from lawyers, photographs, and what she claimed was a birth certificate that listed Robert Harrison as my father. We hired a lawyer and prepared to file a claim against his estate, believing that DNA testing would prove our relationship and secure my inheritance from a man worth over $50 million. The reading of Robert Harrison's will took place in a mahogany-paneled conference room in the most expensive law firm in Dallas, surrounded by his widow, Margaret, his 3 legitimate children, and a handful of business associates who had been left various bequests. I sat in the back row with my mother, clutching the folder of documentation that we believed would change our lives forever.
When the lawyer finished reading the primary bequests to family members and began addressing potential claims against the estate, he mentioned that there had been inquiries from individuals claiming to be illegitimate children of the deceased. Margaret Harrison, an elegant woman in her 70s who radiated the kind of confidence that comes from a lifetime of wealth and privilege, exchanged glances with her children before nodding to the lawyer. The family's attorney, a distinguished man in his 60s named Charles Whitman, rose from his chair with the authority of someone accustomed to crushing inconvenient legal challenges. He had been representing the Harrison family for over 30 years and had obviously dealt with inheritance claims before. His voice was cold and professional as he addressed the room, making it clear that he considered my presence an unwelcome intrusion on the family's grief. "Before we proceed with any DNA testing or formal inheritance claims," Whitman began, "I want to address the individuals present who believe they may have a claim to Mr. Harrison's estate based on alleged paternal relationships. After reviewing the documentation provided by these claimants, I can state definitively that there is no legal basis for any inheritance claims beyond those addressed in the will." My mother squeezed my hand encouragingly, probably thinking this was just legal posturing designed to discourage us from pursuing our rightful claim. She had prepared for this moment for decades, saving every piece of evidence that proved my father's identity and our family's connection to the Harrison fortune. She whispered to me that we shouldn't be intimidated by expensive lawyers who were paid to protect the family's money from legitimate heirs. The lawyer continued his speech, explaining that the Harrison family had dealt with fraudulent paternity claims before, and that they had established protocols for investigating and dismissing such allegations. He mentioned that they had access to comprehensive genealogical records, financial documentation, and legal resources that would quickly expose any false claims made against the estate. His tone suggested that he viewed us as nothing more than opportunistic scammers trying to profit from a wealthy man's death. When he finished his prepared remarks, my lawyer stood to present our evidence and formally request DNA testing to establish paternity. He explained that we had substantial documentation supporting our claim, including financial records showing regular support payments and correspondence that established an ongoing relationship between Patricia Harrison and the deceased. He was professional and respectful, but firm in his insistence that we deserved the same consideration as any potential heir claiming a relationship to Robert Harrison. Margaret Harrison listened to our presentation with an expression of polite skepticism, occasionally whispering to her children or taking notes on a legal pad. Her composure suggested someone accustomed to dealing with unpleasant situations involving family money and people who wanted access to it. When my lawyer finished, she requested a brief recess to confer with her legal team about how to proceed with our claim. During the 15-minute break, I felt confident that we had presented a strong case and that DNA testing would quickly resolve any questions about my parentage. My mother was practically glowing with anticipation, convinced that decades of struggle were finally about to pay off with the recognition and financial security we deserved. She kept repeating that justice was finally going to prevail and that the Harrison family would have to acknowledge me as Robert's son, regardless of their personal feelings about the situation.
When court reconvened, Charles Whitman stood with a thick folder in his hands and an expression that suggested he was about to deliver devastating news. He had clearly spent the recess reviewing additional documentation that he hadn't initially planned to present, probably hoping that our claim could be dismissed without revealing information that the family preferred to keep private. "Your Honor," he began, addressing the probate judge who was overseeing the will reading, "I regret that this matter cannot be resolved as simply as the claimants believe. After consulting with my clients and reviewing comprehensive family records, I must present evidence that definitively disproves any possibility of paternal relationship between the deceased and Mr. Michael Harrison." The lawyer announced coldly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "Your mother was never legally married to your father." The words hit me like a physical blow. Not because they challenged my legitimacy, but because they revealed something far more devastating than I could have imagined. My mother's face went white as she realized that her carefully constructed story was about to be completely demolished by evidence she had never anticipated. Whitman opened his folder and began presenting documentation that painted a completely different picture of my mother's relationship with Robert Harrison. According to the records he displayed, Patricia had never been romantically involved with Robert Harrison at any point in their lives. She had worked briefly as a secretary at Harrison Industries over 40 years ago, but had been fired after 3 months for theft and falsifying timesheets. The monthly checks she had received were not support payments from a secret lover, but rather payments from a settlement agreement related to her wrongful termination lawsuit against the company. Robert Harrison's lawyers had agreed to monthly payments for 20 years to avoid a public legal battle over workplace harassment allegations that could have damaged the company's reputation.
The documentation showed that Patricia had signed a non-disclosure agreement, preventing her from discussing the circumstances of her employment or termination, and that the settlement payments were specifically designated as compensation for lost wages and emotional distress rather than child support. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. Whitman presented hospital records and birth certificates that proved Robert Harrison had been out of the country for 6 months during the period when I would have been conceived. He had been in Europe, managing the company's expansion into international markets, and hadn't returned to the United States until 3 months after my birth. There were passport stamps, hotel receipts, business meeting records, and witness testimonies from dozens of people who could verify his whereabouts during the entire period in question. The lawyer methodically destroyed every aspect of my mother's story, presenting evidence that she had fabricated the entire relationship and had used the settlement money to create an elaborate fiction about my parentage. The photographs she claimed showed her with Robert Harrison were actually pictures of her with other men that she had mislabeled and stored with fake documentation. The letters she said were from my father were obvious forgeries created years after the supposed relationship had ended. As Whitman continued his presentation, my mother began crying uncontrollably, finally understanding that her decades of lies were being exposed in the most public and humiliating way possible. She had built her entire life around a fantasy relationship with a man who barely knew she existed, and had raised me to believe in a father figure who had never shown the slightest interest in either of us. The probate judge reviewed all the evidence carefully before making his ruling, but the outcome was never in doubt once the documentation had been presented. Not only was my inheritance claim denied completely, but the judge referred the matter to the district attorney's office for potential fraud charges related to my mother's attempt to obtain money through false pretenses. The Harrison family's lawyer made it clear that they would be seeking restitution for legal costs and that they were considering a civil lawsuit for defamation and emotional distress. As we left the courthouse that day, my mother finally broke down and confessed the truth that she had hidden from me for nearly 40 decades. She had never been involved with Robert Harrison romantically or otherwise, and had no idea who my biological father actually was. The settlement money from Harrison Industries had been the result of her sexual harassment lawsuit, but she had been so ashamed of the circumstances that she had created an elaborate fantasy to explain the monthly payments and give me a father figure to look up to. She had convinced herself over time that the lie was protecting me from the truth about my origins, but had actually been protecting herself from having to admit that she didn't know who had fathered her child. The DNA testing that we had demanded ended up being conducted as part of the criminal investigation into our fraudulent claim, and it confirmed what the documentation had already proven. There was no genetic relationship between me and Robert Harrison or any member of his family. Today I know the truth about my parentage and my mother's decades of deception, but I still don't know who my biological father actually is. My mother served 6 months in county jail for fraud and perjury, and we were ordered to pay over $40,000 in legal fees to the Harrison family. The monthly payments that had supported us throughout my childhood were revealed to be settlement money that should have ended years earlier, but had continued due to an accounting error at Harrison Industries. This story taught me that sometimes the most elaborate lies are created not to deceive others, but to help the liar avoid confronting painful truths about their own life, and that the children of those lies often pay the highest price when reality finally demands to be acknowledged.